right, welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar on understanding culture versus climate, the keys to effective leadership. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm with TIVC, and I'll be moderating this session where we'll discuss the distinctions between organizational culture and climate. And to me, this is a very interesting and important topic because the terms organizational culture and climate are often conflated, and the definitions can sort of both be a little bit ambiguous. So we'll hear from our panel of experts today on their perspective on the difference between the two, the impact that they have on organizations, and some strategies that are used to measure and improve both culture and climate. I'm really looking forward to hearing our panelists' thoughts on how to unlock an organization's full potential through healthy and thriving culture and climate for a motivated and productive workforce. Excuse me. So today we're joined by our panelist, Amanda Fajak, CEO, Walking the Talk, a ZRG company. Amanda is an expert in culture transformation with over 30 years experience in culture transformation and creating the workplace of the future. She's advised hundreds of leaders from organizations across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, including startups, through some of the largest companies in the world, supporting them to build their culture as a strategic asset. Amanda continually challenges the status quo through applied research into the future of work and innovative product design, and shares her expertise through CEO advisory and keynote speeches. Welcome, and thank you for joining, Amanda.
Thanks, Liz.
We also have Jeffrey Hanrahan, PhD, Director of Organizational Development at TIVC. Jeff is a distinguished researcher and expert in industrial and organizational psychology with extensive experience in analyzing work group dynamics and enhancing organizational effectiveness. His career spans roles as a research psychologist with the U.S. Army Research Institute, a senior data analyst at Walmart Incorporated, and an organizational consultant through his own firm. Jeff has demonstrated a profound ability to lead high-performing teams, develop innovative methodologies for assessing performance, and implement data-driven strategies to improve organizational resilience and effectiveness. He holds a PhD from the University of Connecticut, where his research focused on the emergence of team resilience. His work has been recognized in various publications and presentations at major conferences, highlighting his contributions to the field of psychology and organizational studies. Welcome, and thanks for joining, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate it.
And last but not least, we have Zeve Marcus, Master of Arts and PhD candidate from UCSD and research specialist at TIVC. Zeve has over a decade of experience in experimental psychology, where he honed an understanding of the ways that perceptions shape and influence human behavior. As a research specialist and data scientist with TIVC, he has created innovative and robust organizational measurement tools, along with data visualization dashboards. These tools help to generate actionable insights and inform strategic enhancements to workplace culture and climate. His ability to translate complex data into meaningful visual narratives contributes to a deeper understanding of culture and climate, and helps to shape the strategies that impact workplace environments. Zeve has also leveraged his machine learning expertise to help develop TIVC's AI-driven text analysis tool, which processes qualitative data to reveal insights that drive data-informed and people-first improvements to foster a positive organizational culture. Welcome, and thanks for joining, Zeve.
Thank you so much, Liz. Happy to be here.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's dig in here. We've got some burning questions that I know our audience is ready to learn more about. So, to get us started, let's address the elephant in the room here. How do you define culture and climate? What are the differences between culture and climate? How do they intersect? And why is it important for organizations to distinguish between the two? Can we start with Amanda? What are your thoughts?
So I have an analogy I like to use when I try and differentiate between culture and climate. I always use the analogy of, imagine you've got two teams running onto a field, running onto a court. Both teams are motivated, they're satisfied, they love being on the team, they've kind of encouraged other people to come join the team. But one team plays an offensive game and one team plays a defensive game. The game that people play is culture. The way they feel running onto the field or the court is climate. And if we take a look at the definition of culture, it is the patterns of behavior that get encouraged, discouraged, or get tolerated both by the people in organizations and the systems over time. So it's those patterns of behavior that occur again and again that are kind of really what distinguish culture. It's more of a macro, longer term thing that takes time to develop, whereas climate is something that's a little more transient. And it is quicker to shift and to change. Now, obviously, they can then impact each other. You've got culture, patterns of behavior. Those patterns of behavior, the way you make decisions, the way ideas get generated, impacts how motivated and satisfied people feel, what gets encouraged, discouraged, tolerated, impacts how people feel in the organization. But they are discrete and distinctive concepts. Jeff, I might hand to you. I think you've got some great ideas on that too.
Yeah, that was, I wish I had a great analogy like that. I might take that in the future. So yeah, we have a very similar understanding of organizational culture and climate. So organizational culture, to us at least, to TIVC and to myself, culture, we refer to that as those sort of deep-rooted values, those beliefs and norms that are shared by pretty much all the members of the organization. It really helps to provide that guiding framework for those behaviors, decision-making, and even communication. So I completely agree that it tends to evolve more slowly, and I think it's a little bit more stable over time, whereas climate refers to those employees' immediate perceptions, especially of their work environment and their leadership. Much more fluid. It's more responsive to change in policies, management, daily practices. And because it's so fluid, it can shift quickly based on a lot of different factors, such as leadership behavior, communication within the organization, or even the workplace conditions can have an impact on climate. So essentially, it functions as a snapshot of the current atmosphere of that particular organization.
Yeah. And Jeff, one thing, one of the questions that you were asking Liz in there is, why is it important for organizations to distinguish? And I think building on what we've both said is, let me give you an example from a company that we worked with where the climate, the satisfaction, employee engagement, whatever we want to call it, was extremely high. It was in the 90s, but they were about to go out of business. So people felt really motivated, really satisfied, but strategically, the company was not focused on the right things, and the way they were behaving was really different. So they were so internally focused, they had lost sight of the customer, and they weren't able to really effectively respond to customer needs. They weren't able to respond to the market, and that their business was fundamentally put at risk. And I think that's why, it's really important to distinguish between this idea of climate and culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the points that I wanted to touch on, at least when we're distinguishing between the two, one of the main reasons why it's so important to distinguish between culture and climate is for targeting essentially the right interventions that we might use. So climate issues such as low morale, they can be addressed through short-term solutions like improving communication, improving leadership engagement, that sort of thing. Whereas cultural issues, those misaligned values, they require those deeper, I guess, more systemic, long-term strategy, like leadership modeling or revising any policies and procedures. So that's one of the main important differences between the two, and why it's so important to distinguish them is because it can really help you develop a plan of attack on how to improve any sort of organizational issues.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you both. So it sounds like what I'm hearing is that culture is that kind of the bigger game that we're playing, and climate is something that's a little more fluid, more dynamic, can change, and it's important. I mean, obviously they intersect and can influence each other, but it's also very important for organizations to be able to distinguish between what is culture, what is climate, for the right interventions to be able to kind of appropriately strategize for the future. That is very insightful. Thank you both. So we know that culture and climate can significantly impact an organization's performance, as Amanda was saying. So, in your experience, how do they influence motivation and productivity differently? And how can leaders leverage both to drive success? Jeff, can we hear from you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So at least starting with culture's influence on motivation and productivity, there are a couple different areas, but one that I think is really important to mention is just intrinsic motivation and shared values. So employees who feel aligned with the organization's core values, whether that is innovation, teamwork, collaboration, whatever you might have, they're intrinsically motivated to perform at their job because they align with those core values, and they have essentially an ownership in that to some degree. So cultural alignment, I think, really helps develop that deeper connection to an organization's purpose, which in turn can drive that long-term commitment and, I guess, enthusiasm when they are working on the job. Another aspect of it is the behavioral norms and expectations. So culture sets those clear norms for how employees should be behaving within the workplace. And it also identifies what success looks like, which essentially shapes productivity. Climate, on the other hand, it's a little bit more immediate. So looking at it in job satisfaction and morale. So if you're supporting a supportive climate, in a climate where employees feel recognized and valued, that tends to lead to higher job satisfaction and morale. So those are just a couple areas where both climate and culture have an influence on productivity and motivation. I'll let Zeve address this part before we get into how leaders can leverage both.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, if I may, just another point on climate. So one important thing to consider with climate is aspects like psychological safety. So this idea that employees in an organization perceive the workplace as one where they can authentically express ideas and openly do so without fear of negative repercussions, without fear of judgment, things like that. And the way that can drive up performance, in addition to what was already mentioned, is that's when you have people able to remain curious and able to come up with novel solutions and offer their ideas openly, not just toe the line. And in doing so, that's very growth oriented. That helps overall mission of many organizations, and leads to better performance, and not just getting the job done, but getting it done well, and getting it done in a way that, hey, if we're connecting with culture, when you have that feeling of sort of self, when oneself is invested in the mission, the goals, the values of an organization, that's also going to drive up organizational performance, because it's not just then a day-to-day checking off the boxes, getting the job done, but it's enhancing that because it's a reflection of your own self-interest from the point of view of an employee. So hopefully this can enrich our ideas of how climate and culture can affect organizational performance. It's kind of like multifaceted, just like these constructs are, because they're multifaceted. So they're involved in organization and organizational performance in a lot of different ways.
100%. And so how can leaders leverage both of those to drive that success? What can leaders do?
I'll tackle this one first.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few different, I guess, strategies that they can use to really leverage both to help drive success. One of them, and I kind of mentioned this alignment piece. So aligning culture with your strategic goals. So I think it kind of falls on leadership, and they really have to make sure that the culture values within the organization, again, that innovation, collaboration, teamwork, are aligned with the organization's long-term strategy. So really just by modeling those values, reinforcing them through the rewards and communication with their employees, the leadership and leaders create a high-performing environment that employees really buy into. Another is, again, I think I mentioned this in my previous answer, but fostering a positive climate to help with sort of those short-term or immediate gains. So culture change is long-term, but leaders can improve the climate really by addressing the short-term needs of employees, communication, recognition, and leadership visibility being one. So really by creating that positive, that supportive climate, leadership can boost the employee morale and productivity.
Yeah, 100%. Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff. And so I want to talk a little bit about, so there are a lot of misconceptions about culture and climate, right? Such as the idea that they can be measured with the same tools. So when we're looking at, productivity and engagement and morale, we're thinking like, okay, we can just use one measurement tool and we can get a sense of what culture is and what climate is. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings that you've encountered, and how can organizations more accurately assess these different constructs? Zeve, can we hear from you?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, first of all, this is just another area where those distinctions are very important. to developing the tools that are used to measure these different constructs. So to illustrate this point, I can take a little insight from Shakespeare. And when Juliet says something like, because I'm hoping I remember it correctly, but that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The insight there is that, yeah, so for objects, tangible objects, it's really straightforward when you have direct measurements of things. Doesn't matter if you call it a yellow tulip, it'll reflect red light, it'll have the shape and things that are determined by the edges of of the rose. So you can sit there all day and call it what you want, and it's not going to change those essential properties of that object. With culture and climate, it's not the same, and Juliet was no psychometrician, so didn't comment on this. But with culture and climate, these are complex constructs where they're abstracted from that kind of immediacy and that kind of direct measurement. So the way that we define them and the words that we use to describe them are going to directly impact the measurement tools that are developed as a result. So for something like culture, where it's complex and embedded in, there are these shared norms, beliefs, all of what we've been discussing here. Some of that has to do with things that aren't always immediately perceptible. So you can take a quantitative approach for measuring, for example, sort of behaviors that define that culture. And it gets a little trickier when you get into beliefs and some of these more subtle aspects of culture. And so taking a mixed methods approach rather than the misconception of, hey, that you can take a quick some quick survey and that might be it. Taking a mixed methods approach can get you some of those deeper insights when we're talking about something like deep-rooted values, deep-rooted beliefs, not just as espoused by leaders, but that are held by the employees. So for culture, taking that mixed methods approach can inform those deeply rooted values, expectations, beliefs, things along those lines. And yeah, so involving the quantitative side along with the qualitative side, where you have, say, from interviews, focus groups, open-ended responses and things of that sort, folks will respond differently than when constrained to the choices that are on a survey. So in analyzing responses of that sort, you can get to the different, the different notions, topics around, say, the values, beliefs, all of these culturally relevant kind of factors here. And you can go a step further and look at it in context of the emotions that are kind of surrounding the topics that are brought up, the things that people are saying. You can get at the sentiment behind what people are saying and infer more about what they actually believe, and therefore be able to more adequately and accurately assess the alignment with those cultural values, beliefs, and the things that are sort of the expectations of the workforce. So for culture, I think that mixed methods approach can be more appropriate because of how these things are defined and understood. And for climate, I think a big misconception and that I come across is that it just has to do with employee well-being and satisfaction. And while it does, it's definitely very important. Those are very important facets of a climate and just of an organization to attend to those things. Those in and of themselves are not measurements of the climate. If you have someone who's low on morale, you won't know how to intervene or what to do if you're not doing a comprehensive assessment that gets at all the different factors that influence that. So it's also a complex construct that takes attention to, in the development of these tools, takes attention to what are the influencers of those outcomes. Those may be facets within climate, but you want to definitely set up your measurements so that you are assessing what influences those outcomes and those particular facets. So yeah, that the distinction is important between them for measurement purposes, and just understanding what is influencing those important outcomes of climate is very important to include in these tools so that you can assess and address what needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, creating the right tool for the right construct to make sure that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. 100%. Thanks so much, Zeve. Jeff, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of the measurement aspect of culture and climate, a very common misconception that I see a lot is that they can be accurately assessed with one-time surveys. when in reality, we know that both culture and climate are really dynamic and they require ongoing measurement. So climate can change pretty quickly, as we've all mentioned. And if you really want to get a good understanding of it, it should be assessed regularly with pulse surveys, a regular cadence to a survey to just check up on your employees will really help give you a better idea of your organizational climate. Similarly with culture, it's more stable, but it needs qualitative backing and periodic assessments to really capture those deep-rooted beliefs, those deep-rooted insights that employees have. So one-time surveys really just miss the key changes in both climate, which can and does fluctuate, as well as culture, which really evolves slowly but consistently over time. Another common misconception that a lot of people have with culture and climate is that leadership alone dictates the culture. So in reality, leadership does play a really, really big role in shaping the culture. It's also co-created, I guess, by the members of the organization. So employees, managers, and even sometimes in some cases, external stakeholders can reinforce or really challenge those behavioral norms. So a lot of organizations might overlook those middle managers or the employee influences, and failing to take into account their perspectives it could be catastrophic to culture and climate.
Got it. So what I'm hearing is, that culture and climate, while they do intersect, they are important to sort of distinguish because you will need different measurement tools for each. And while you may be able to capture, some of the climate information through quantitative means, right, through a survey, it should be done sort of iteratively, because just once is that snapshot in time and it doesn't capture that sort of dynamic nature of climate. And Zeve, as you mentioned, culture, they're both very complex, but culture is one of those things that is, maybe more slower moving, but you do need that qualitative data, because essentially what you want to know is, what do I have to do to fit in here, right? You're understanding, like, what is it in this culture? How do I fit in? What are those kinds of beliefs? And you can't really get at those answers through just a survey, right? You need that open-ended, that qualitative stuff. So having a mixed methods approach is more suitable when you're trying to understand more about an organization's culture.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Excellent. All right. Well, so we know that, and Jeff, you sort of touched on it a little bit. Leadership, while it is crucial, doesn't play the entirety of the role in culture and climate, but it does help. It does play a large role in shaping organizational culture and climate. Can you share some examples of how leadership practices have maybe positively or negatively affected these different aspects in any organizations that you've worked with? Amanda, I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Yeah. And look, I completely agree. I think, leadership is an essential component. In 30 years of working on culture, I don't think I've yet done a culture transformation that hasn't involved leaders doing something different themselves. But in and of itself, it will not be enough. But the reason leaders are so important is for a couple of reasons. One is, exactly as you were saying, Liz, people look around, how do I need to behave in order to fit here? And ultimately, we look up to the most successful people in the organization because they are the ones we want to emulate. I want to be like the person who's the most successful here. So therefore, if you really think about how the practices of leaders affect people, it's through what gets role modeled. It's through the behavior that they demonstrate. And, we're called walking the talk. Our methodology is called walking the talk, which is about, the difference between what you say and what you do. And the reality is people will follow what leaders do even more than what they say. And that is the bit that's the most important. So, as a leader, you are inherently a role model. People look to what you do because it gives them a clue on what they should do. I think, Jeff, you were mentioning that before. It makes it seem enticing. It makes it seem, interesting. So you kind of think, well, if they're able to get away with it, then therefore, if I emulate them, I'm also going to be able to kind of demonstrate this behavior, and I will be safe in the system. And it's inspiring, right? So, oh, that's what I need to do in order to be successful. So, the behaviors that a leader engages in is really critical. We also are really interested in what we call symbols. So it's our use of finite resources. There's only so much time, there's only so much money, there's only so many promotions, there's only so many office spaces and car parks, and there's only so many words in the English, French, German, Spanish, whatever language. And when you as a leader make choices in those finite resources, what you're doing is sending a message to people how they behave. So if you always choose to visit the customer versus kind of spend time with your internal team, you're probably saying the customer is really important. If you spend time with your boss versus your direct reports, you're probably saying hierarchy and status matters here. So, you can shape the culture and shape the behavior of people quite quickly through those choices that you make. And I think, in my experience, a lot of underestimate those small things that they do and the impact that they have. Over time, they accumulate to really create the experience people have in the culture. So, Jeff, do you want to, I think you might have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, just from a personal example, to just show how I guess leadership impacts the culture and climate. I was consulting with a healthcare organization whose senior leadership recognized that they had a pretty big problem with morale. So after I came in and did some digging, we found that there was really a lack of recognition or perceived recognition, and a lack of, I should say, development opportunities. So what was eventually done was implementing career development programs, mentorship initiatives, and then some feedback opportunities from leadership where the line level employees could provide feedback, suggestions, comments, concerns to leadership. Once that was implemented, you could really see a huge shift in not only the climate, which was pretty much immediate, but as well as the culture over the long term. So I really do think that it is the leadership modeling and showing concern for their employees, taking the time to listen to them, to demonstrate that they actually value their employee input, goes a really, really long way.
And I think, Jeff, just, building on that, it just made me think, leaders also have the decision rights over the systems inside the organization, and that really does impact the culture and ultimately the climate as well. So, how are we going to run our performance management system? What's the way we do our recruiting? If we're going to be really customer-centric, do we invest in customer-centric systems where we can have one single view of our customer? And those are decisions that are made at the most senior levels in the organization, which kind of comes back to your point earlier around culture being this more macro kind of perspective, but then also impacting the day-to-day. And I think, leaders have the decision rights over those systems.
Absolutely do. Absolutely agree.
Yep. So I'm hearing that leadership behavior, whether it be positive or negative, and if it's just even small tweaks, right? Some of those maybe changing or improving some of those behaviors, even at the smallest level, can have really large impacts. And so it's not just behavior, but it's all, well, it is, I suppose it is a type of behavior, right, Jeff, to have that kind of constant and open feedback from all levels within the organization, just to, understand a little bit. So leadership behavior has the ability to positively or negatively impact culture and climate.
It absolutely does.
Let me just ask, what are some ways, let's say, if an organization has a poor culture or climate, what are some things that can happen to maybe turn things around, shift it to something more positive? Zeve, we haven't heard from you in a little while. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, happy to address this, and we'll echo some of what we went over in leadership's role, at least for culture and climate, and that is demonstrating what they want from their workforce. So, in a way, knowledge about the influence that they have is going to lead to their own accountability for doing those things. So, when you ask about leadership accountability to who? Well, to themselves, for understanding the impact that having that kind of demonstrable behavioral alignment with the culture, understanding the impact that has on employees, for, hey, demonstrating what they want from them, but also to show that these are not expectations for thee, but not for me. They're expectations of everyone, to everyone in the organization. It's a culture that is permeating throughout the organization at all levels, rather than these are just expectations of you, and I, leadership, will do whatever I'd like, sort of a thing. So, so definitely the impact of leadership is important there, and for climate leadership, like we sort of went over, has the control to make those small shifts that can really have immediate, timely impact to the climate. So can't overstate the importance of things like psychological safety that really has timely impact on a bunch of important climate-related factors. Things like increasing, trust in leadership, trust in one's colleagues. So they have the power to sort of make these decisions around supporting collaborations versus just demanding cooperation. And there's a big difference there in the active sort of approach of employees to take on collaborative sort of team effort related work. So increasing psychological safety is also important for driving the perception that everyone's contribution here is valued. So inclusivity of different backgrounds and perspectives is going to add to employees feeling valued very readily. And we already went over a little bit of the factors like curiosity and fostering that kind of growth-oriented learning, continuous learning approach. It's all kind of wrapped up in psychological safety. So again, it's hard for me to not tout the sort of positive effects that increasing psychological safety can have, and for both culture and climate, involving employees in the process. So involving employees in the process of shaping the culture through feedback loops, through one way of looking at it is through assessment and intervention that sort of documents what people are feeling at the climate and cultural level. But also this can be implemented in just showing value for their contributions to shaping things. So these can be employee forwarded committees, things along those lines. And and for both, just to assess and address and do that over time shows a commitment to and a valuing of employees' input, and that they prioritize being able to shape things in a way that is beneficial to all, not just to some. So
you mentioned a really important point, is that it almost starts with the leader's awareness, right, of their own behaviors to be able to turn things around. They have to first be aware. What is it that I'm doing or not doing? And what can I change? How do I improve? What is it that I'm expecting of my employees? And maybe I need to, kind of step up my game or whatever it is, right? But it starts with that self-reflection. And then as you mentioned, just increasing the levels of psychological safety, because it has impacts on collaboration and curiosity, open communication and feedback, as well as inclusion, right, in those decision-making processes. So thank you, Zeve. Really, really insightful stuff there. Amanda, do you have thoughts on this?
So it's slightly different tack. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. If you've got poor culture and climate, number one, take action, right? Stop measuring, do action. I mean, I think it is the shadow side potentially of continually pulsing, is you continue to get to see again and again and again the same thing. So I think, evaluation without action is not particularly useful. It's not going to help, and it's not going to fundamentally change anything. So, that would be my first tip, is really look at what you can do that really practically makes a difference. I think the other thing is, it is about going deep enough. So I think from a climate perspective, one of the things where I observe that companies go wrong is they chunk it down a little bit too much, because every leader does impact culture, and then it's great to democratize the action planning. But at some point you do need to look at the broader systemic things that one individual team can't kind of actually take action on. So I think it is about looking locally and acting globally, even in the climate space. I think that's important. And I think, it is also then, and this is where the link between climate and culture comes in. And, we have a client, in fact, who had spent 2 to 3 years trying to shift their climate results. And they had addressed collaboration, they'd addressed communication, they'd addressed the pay issues, they'd addressed all the things that had come out in climate survey, yet they couldn't get the NPS scores to shift. And so when we came in and we looked from a cultural perspective, one of the things we identified was complexity. And that was killing purpose, passion, and care, and the meaning of the work that they had. So the problem is they were kind of not quite, and I think that taps into what sort of Zeve was talking before about. You've got to get deep enough to the beliefs. You've got to get deep enough to the values to really make sure you're addressing the issue at the right level. In this particular case, complexity was the thing that unlocked it. In another client we worked with, they were trying to build customer centricity. And they couldn't shift that no matter how many systems, how much training, how much structure they put in place. They weren't able to move that because they had an I know best mindset. So until they could tackle the I know best mindset, they weren't actually able to unlock their culture results. And by the way, it impacted collaboration. So it was impacting climate and the extent to which people worked together and they felt like they were one team and they were hitting their results. So, going deep enough, I think, would be the second key point, I would say, that makes a difference.
Yeah, that does. That makes a huge difference. And that's a great example. You can measure all day long, but without action and without measuring the right thing, you're not going to be able to move the needle on culture or climate because you're not assessing, with the right tools. Fantastic. So I want to know a little bit about how does culture and climate of a company, how does that affect employee retention? I mean, are we, does it matter at all? I mean, these are sort of the soft, nebulous constructs. Jeff, I'd love to hear your thoughts, about culture and climate and employee retention.
Yeah. So both culture and climate within a company has a pretty large role to play on the employee retention. It shapes long-term engagement of employees as well as the day-to-day job satisfaction. So both are critical for employee retention, but very much operate on different levels. So culture influences, again, that long-term loyalty really by helping shape the employee's sense of commitment. It helps them align with the values, as well as it helps with that sense of belonging within the workplace. On the other hand, climate, it directly affects that short-term job satisfaction, role satisfaction, task satisfaction, as well as engagement and just general employee well-being. So an organization that really works to align its culture with a supportive, positive climate, I'd say is more likely to retain its employees over the long term, whereas any misalignment between culture and climate might actually lead to that sort of dissatisfaction among the workforce, leading to those higher turnover rates.
I see. Okay. So yeah, climate affects retention because it's sort of like, well, I like my job. I'm okay at these tasks. But culture is really that sense of belonging and purpose. My tasks, my job serves a larger purpose, which is kind of that culture. And so if I feel all of those things, then I'm more likely to stay with that company. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Zeve, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you've said, Jeff, but I would also add to that a stable and consistent culture provides a sense of predictability. So being able to understand how what the culture is and how the organization functions at different levels is going to inform how robust it is to, say, external factors, market changes, things that can possibly influence, in other contexts, turnover rates and become stressors when you have the predictability of understanding your culture. And, obviously with these other factors being aligned with it and everything that you've mentioned, that is a more comfortable place, along with, with loyalty and all these other factors that are being considered here. So that predictability and stability of a culture, which can include being agile, being, having things that aren't necessarily that you can predict everything that's done in all situations, but it provides a stable foundation that lets you understand how the organization is moving forward. And so that can help to ease things like turnover rates. And on the side of climate, once again, to bring up a little psychological safety, just because again, that provides kind of a safety net against a lot of these stressors that directly influence turnover rate. So when we're talking about low morale, when we're talking about low satisfaction overall, you can adjust that pretty readily in a timely manner using kind of psychological safety forward interventions. So being able to raise that psychological safety gives employees a sense of being valued, a sense of being able to reach new heights, so to speak, with remaining curious and learning. And it acts as almost like a safeguard against a lot of the stressors that influence turnover rates. So burnout and being overworked, and these things are not a part of a high psychologically safe culture, or climate rather. So that's also a pretty important factor here for reducing turnover, is protecting against these against various stressors. And there are other elements of climate that can also influence that.
Absolutely. And that's a good point that you made about culture kind of offering that sort of sense of stability and structure. I like that. All right, I've got one more question here, and I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity for all of you all to answer, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. I've seen some really great questions in the Q&A here, so I want to leave some time for that. All right, last question. So organizational climate can change relatively quickly, right? We know that that's pretty dynamic, and culture tends to evolve a little bit more slowly. So how should organizations approach managing these changes, especially in times of significant disruption or transformation? And Amanda, I know you're working with this sort of transformational culture. Can you give us some insights here?
I'll do a rapid fire. I think there's two things that make the big difference. I would say focus. You focus on everything, then if everything's important, nothing is. So the more you can get focused on the few key things that are going to make the biggest difference, that is what's going to fundamentally unlock your change. And in time where we just don't have many hours in the day, we have got so many things on the agenda, we're dealing with so many fires we have to fight, trying to take on too much means, ultimately, my observation, it becomes too hard. And I think one of the questions is, how long does culture take to change? And in my experience, in my view, the more focused you can be, the quicker you're going to be able to get acceleration of people shifting their behavior and doing things differently. And then the other part that is the pigeon pair to that is focus on the root cause. Get down to the few key beliefs, the few key things that sit at the core, as we talked about in the previous example, that you can really kind of have maximum impact with. And I think if you focus on the root cause, that's the key.
Got it. Okay. So during a whole bunch of disruptive changes, yes, it seems like everything is a priority, but if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So really kind of focusing in on maybe one or two of those key sort of issues, right? Then that will kind of help to sort out the rest. All right. Fantastic. Zeve, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, definitely important for culture at the level of culture to reinforce values in times of change if they're adequate. So if it's a positive culture that's effective, holding to and reinforcing those values shows, again, that consistency, that resilience of the culture that is, as we talked about, is helpful for turnover or preventing turnover, but is also just helpful for moving forward as an organization through tumultuous times. So level of culture, I think that's very important. And for climate, I think being able to assess adequately, address, intervene, and reassess, doing that shows an attentiveness to the climate by leadership and by the organization. So merely having the sense to do so, to be concerned, shows attentiveness, and that is also helpful in those harder times. It shows wanting to make it through and come out the other end in a positive manner. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. Dedication from leadership to wanting to improve, right? Either if it's assessing climate or just reinforcing those core values. Let's say, for example, it's a value for the employees, value for people, reinforcing that during those really disruptive or tumultuous times can help improve that culture. Jeff, do you have any final thoughts on this question before we move to the Q&A?
Yeah, I'll just add in one one small piece. So especially and specifically during times of disruption, I think it would be really important for organizations to really stabilize the climate first. And there's a couple different ways that that can be done. One of which is through frequent and very clear and transparent communication. So that consistent communication from the leaders really helps to reduce that uncertainty or anxiety that employees might have during those disruptive times. Of course, psychological safety and support. So offering the resources and any kind of support to make sure that your employees are feeling safe and valued during these times of disruption. And I think that one of the last strategies is really just engage the employees in the process. So by involving employees in the decision-making or any sort of feedback channels that you're trying to establish, it really helps to create a sense of that ownership and inclusion and belonging in the organizations, all of which I think are really important, not only to address the immediate climate needs, but also can help really shift the culture in the long term.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A. I know this has been such an interesting discussion here. Let's see. There was an interesting one here. How does succession planning influence the culture? So, I mean, we talk a little bit about succession planning and, just the importance of having kind of a structure in place just to make sure that, when one generation leaves, there are those individuals in an organization who are able to kind of step up and step into those positions. How does that influence the culture? I mean, we've got, I think in one of the previous questions, there was a question about different generations. Are there 4 or 5 in the workforce now? How does this kind of succession planning through the generations impact a culture? Does it change? Does it evolve? Is it a good thing? Any panelists want to tackle this one?
I'll take a crack at it, Liz. I think there's a couple of things. One is succession and promotion are symbols and systems inside an organization. So in that respect, they send a message about the culture. So who you promote, who you put into a senior position, sends a message about actually what's truly valued in this organization. But it's also an opportunity to shape the culture. So I think the answer is sort of, it depends. Because if your goal is to sustain the culture that you have, then your succession, if it's thoughtfully conducted, should enable the continuation of that culture. And equally, if you're looking to evolve and transform your culture, your strategy shifted, you need to evolve your culture, then that succession is a huge opportunity to accelerate and cause that culture to shift.
Yeah, that actually makes so much sense. If you want continuity in the culture, right, then that succession planning looks a certain way. And if the culture needs to evolve with the times and change, then you find those individuals and those individuals are chosen to kind of lead the culture in a different direction. Yeah, that makes full sense. Let's see. Here's a good one. Oh, this is a great one. Okay. So how amenable is culture to change? Or rather, how long would a culture change initiative take to have real effects? And so, Amanda, I know you were saying that, with focus, it can change a little more quickly. But, as I understand, culture shift can sometimes take years to see the full effects, maybe 5 to 10 years. And I understand that you think that it can happen a little sooner than that. So how long, let's say, does it take to have real effects after a culture change initiative?
So I'm happy to just kick us off, but I'd love to hear Zeve and Jeff's view on this one. Look, I've seen culture shift in 6 to 9 months in extremely large organizations, right? But can you sustain it over that period? And that's no. Right? So you can get patterns of behavior to shift quite quickly, but you need persistence and consistency. You need to align your systems. You need to align your symbols. You need to ensure that, the kind of focus is consistent a lot over a period of time for it to sustain. And I think somebody talked about leaders, middle managers, influences. It's got to be kind of systemic across all levels. So I think what you can do, if you get focused enough and you get focused on the right things, you can actually accelerate quite quickly, but maintaining it then is where the hard work happens. And that, Liz, is I think where it takes a period of time to really ensure that you've got that kind of engine going to keep it sustained.
Yep, that makes sense. Jeff, Zeve, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point. It's easy. Well, I don't want to say easy, but it's easier to shift behaviors. It's much more difficult to maintain that shift. And I think that is really the key there. I have not personally seen a culture shift happen in 6-9 months. That may just be because my measurement timing was off at the time. But I absolutely agree that a culture shift requires long-term systemic changes. We on this panel have covered a lot of ground in the world of culture and climate, and I don't even think we've scratched the surface on how deeply rooted some of these things can actually be and how difficult it can be to change. All of that takes time. So culture is able to be changed. I think depending on the culture of the organization, sometimes it takes shorter amounts of time, other times it is much longer, but still I think it takes a lot of time.
And actually, Jeff, coming back to Zeve's point on psychological safety, I think there are certain cultural elements that are broken arms and legs and some that are cancers, just to give the analogy, because actually there are certain behaviors that I think are easier to shift. You know, I want to be more accountable. I want to kind of have more customer centricity. I have got fear inside my organization. I'm unable to speak up. Much stickier, much harder. You have to persist much longer to get them shifted inside your organization. So the type of cultural shift that you're trying to make, also, I agree. I think that can make a really big difference in how quickly you can see a shift as well.
No, that's a really good point. Absolutely spot on in that there are certain facets of culture that need to be changed more than others. And especially in the example that you gave, if you're running into an organization that has issues with psychological safety, their employees are actually fearful of speaking up. That's a pretty big hurdle to get over. Not to say that you can't, but it takes a lot of effort to do that. 100%.
I can just quickly add to this, and I think you sort of alluded to this, Jeff, that there are certain aspects of culture that are more readily changed and still distinct from climate change. But if you're using for example, just behavioral patterns as an indicator of what culture is, rather than some of these other involved facets related to beliefs that are driving those behaviors and sort of the underlying deeply rooted motivations for those things, then we're back to talking measurement a little bit and considering, you know, what is it that is being changed, and when that's consistent, that is great, and you can see consistent behavioral patterns changed. But that's also why it's important in some places, depending on the needs of an organization, to focus on what's needed and what needs to change. But speaking holistically about culture, I think there are definitely some things that aren't as readily changed as, say, behavioral patterns of the workforce. And so again, just this idea that how we measure these things is sort of determined by how we define them, and yeah, so certain things are harder to change than others, and especially when talking about culture and overall shifts in these things.
So that kind of brings me to one of the questions that's in the Q&A here, and we're talking about culture change and the time duration. Sometimes it can be initiated and you can really gain some traction in a short amount of time, but then sustaining those behaviors and really dedicating the leadership's time, everyone's time into making sure that these are sticky changes can take a longer period of time. But so one of the questions here is, how does culture change? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Is it from the center out? And how do you go about changing a culture? Any thoughts?
I guess I'll weigh in my 2 cents on this one and let Amanda and Zeve follow up. But I think that it starts at the top. Now, again, we've mentioned before that leadership isn't the only factor in a culture change, but it plays a huge and vital role in it. And I think one of the places that if you are interested in changing your culture, one of the places to start is at the top, really engaging with leadership to make sure that their culture is in alignment, again, with the organizational strategy, making sure that their behaviors within the workplace model those changes that they're expecting to see. So absolutely, I do think it starts at the top, but I want to be clear that that is not the only place that it can start, and certainly not the only place that you should target some interventions or strategies for change there.
And I think it's this difference between where you start and then what it takes to really kind of get the flywheel going, right? So 100% agree with Jeff. Got to start at the top, because remember, we all look to the top, to the people that are most successful, so how they behave. So no matter how many brilliant reports, posters, comms campaigns you put out there, if your leaders on a day-to-day basis are fundamentally behaving in a different way from what everything that's in the printed media and on the flashy kind of videos shows, it's irrelevant, right? You are really wasting your time and your money. But I would also say, in our experience, a couple of key systems often need to change as well. The thing that touches everyone all the time. We were working with a company on simplicity, and then every single time somebody went to do their expenses on a monthly basis, they had the most complex, difficult expenses system. And every time they went to do their expenses on the monthly basis, they went, this company is not simple. So no matter all the great messaging, no matter how much the leaders role modeled, every time I went to do my expenses, I just got this message to say this company's not simple. So, there is a behavior symbol systems. You've got to kind of work it systemically across all of those, starting with the behaviors at the top.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, Amanda, like you were saying, and Jeff, kind of, you're looking to the top. It starts with leadership. It's their initiative. We're looking for, examples. This is what's expected behavior. It's that shift really should start at the top. However, Jeff, I think you mentioned that it's not the only place that you can start. I mean, for, let's just say, colleagues and or, small teams with management, you can begin to shift climate, which changes a little bit more rapidly, and by improving psychological safety, curiosity, all those things, you can improve that climate, and perhaps then it starts to grow, let's say, within that department. So it starts from a team and then it grows within that department. Perhaps it can at least shift slowly, but perhaps more outwardly. Okay, well, we're at 2 minutes until time. Unless there is a panelist who sees a burning question they'd like to answer, I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. I have learned a lot. I'm hoping that our audience has enjoyed this and has learned a lot. Are there any final concluding remarks on culture or climate before we hop off?
I will take this one. Coming from a measurement background, I think one of the most important things that you can do when you're interested in a culture or a climate change, especially after assessing it, follow up with some actionable results. Amanda, you said that evaluation without action is useless, and that's another piece that I'm going to be taking from you. So I think that is absolutely crucial to not only follow up, but show your employees that you're doing something to act on the results that they receive from their culture or climate assessments.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to back up to something that Zeve said, which is that you need mixed methods, that, you cannot assume that if you're measuring climate, you're going to be measuring culture and vice versa. You really need to have a fit for purpose assessment so that you really are measuring the right thing, be really clear on your research question when you're going in.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, Amanda, Zeve, Jeff, thank you so much for your time and your wonderful insights. Like I said, I've learned a lot, and to the audience, thank you all for joining. That's all we've got. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.